I went to the hospital for a simple checkup. Nothing serious. But when I walked past one of the labor rooms, I saw my husband inside, holding a woman's hand, whispering, "You're doing great, baby." I froze. That woman was my sister, Christina. Please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're hearing my story of revenge. I want to know how far it's gone. If you're listening to this, let me warn you, I am not telling you a story for sympathy. I'm telling you a story so you understand how far someone close can cut, how hollow the smiles can be, and how carefully plotted revenge can taste like a cold, clean justice. I promise to be honest, even about the ugly parts, because if you've ever been betrayed by people you trusted, you already know the truth. Pain is complicated, and payback is not always pretty. The day it happened looked harmless. I remember the small things because the mind clings to tiny details when everything else is falling apart. The bland hospital coffee in a paper cup, the fluorescent lights that hummed with indifferent patience, the way my phone buzzed in my bag with messages I ignored. I thought it was just a routine appointment. I thought I'd be in and out. I wanted to think that my life was ordinary and safe. I'd been with Mark for 12 years. We met when I was 26 and stupidly romantic. He had an easy laugh and a way of making me feel like the most interesting person in whatever room we happened to be in. We married after 3 years together, bought a modest house in a quiet street, had jobs that paid the bills, and a marriage that had its share of late-night arguments, but also long seasons where we'd sit, reading on the couch, no TV on, just the comfort of each other's presence. I wasn't naive. I knew people changed. I'd seen how friends drifted apart, how time could blunt the sharpest promises. But I never expected the person I shared a bed with to be the architect of my ruin. Christina and I were close once. Growing up, we shared secrets, clothes, and confessions whispered under blankets. We promised, as kids do, that nothing would split us. But life rearranges people. She moved back to our city when her marriage fell apart, and I welcomed her. She stayed on the spare room couch for months. I fed her, lent my car, and listened when she cried herself hoarse about being used and abandoned. You don't walk away from family when they're bleeding. You don't, unless you're weak and selfish, I used to tell myself. So when I saw them that day, shock didn't just register. It detonated. My knees went soft. I could feel blood drain from my face. For a second, the world tilted, like someone had nudged the table, and everything in me slipped. Mark looked up, and for a fraction of a second, his eyes found mine. There was something in that look. Panic? Embarrassment? Guilt? But mostly a strange, cold calculation, as if he was counting the cost of me noticing him, and my presence was an inconvenience to be managed. Christina's face flushed red with labor pains, and her breath came in ragged, quick bursts. She was breathing around him. He had his hand on her forehead like he'd been rehearsing tenderness. I remember the absurd normality of that gesture, how it made me feel like an intruder, not in a hospital, but in the life I thought was mine. For a while, I didn't move. I probably looked like someone waiting for a bus that would never come, frozen, blank, heart pounding. I overheard a nurse ask about a family member, and my voice went somewhere else, small, distant. Is this your husband?" she asked Christina. Christina murmured, and I watched Mark say, "Yeah," casual, steady, like he was answering a question about the weather. That single syllable felt like a verdict. You might be thinking, why would he do it? Why would my sister do it? I asked those questions too, in the quiet rooms of my house later, in the raw hours when the world turns slow and memory is a knife. There are no simple answers. People betray for ego, for convenience, for fear, for lust, for the stupid thrill of being wanted. Sometimes there's money involved. Sometimes there's silence. In our case, there was all of it in little poisonous doses. Mark's boredom, Christina's craving for being chosen, and a dozen small moments where the right choices weren't made until they couldn't be undone. When I walked out of the hospital, the city was the same city. Cars honked, people pushed past me, commuters glued to their devices. The ordinary cadence of other people's lives was obscene. I wanted to scream and tell everyone in the street what had happened, to tear the truth into the open. But I didn't. I had to think. Rage makes you reckless. I needed strategy. The choice at that moment to lash out on instinct or to plan my response would determine everything. I chose planning. I went home and sat at the kitchen table until dawn. I looked at the mess of the life we'd built. Unpaid bills tucked beside receipts, a half-drunk cup of tea that had gone cold, and photographs of us smiling on improbable vacations. I read every expression in those photos differently now. A memory of some ordinary Tuesday felt like a lie. I replayed the hospital scene in my head, over and over, a film without sound that burned like acid. Before you judge me for my coldness in the aftermath, try to imagine living in that moment. Betrayal isn't the climax in a movie you saw before. It's a slow erosion. Each little thing, the lie about business trips, the unusual silence at dinner, the occasional text messages he would erase with a finger, stacked up until the hospital moment made the pile collapse. Anger turned into a hard, precise instrument. I needed to be surgical.
Something now that will make some of you uneasy. I stalked them. Not in a melodramatic way like a daytime soap, but the kind of careful observation that's almost clinical. I watched Mark's habits, tracked when he left for work and when he stayed late, photographed small inconsistencies that would later matter. I had to be careful. I couldn't let him see me. If he suspected I was watching, he'd pivot. I learned where Christina's bank account had payments, where she met men for coffee, and how Mark's phone would light up at odd hours. It's amazing how reckless people become when something new feeds them. They forget the tiny warnings they once recognized in themselves. People often conflate revenge with cruelty. That's a mistake. My revenge wasn't about hurting for the sake of hurting. It was about restoring balance, about making the truth visible and irreversible. I wanted them to feel the kind of exposure I'd felt when I walked into that labor room. I wanted the humiliation to be as public as the secrecy had been. The plan had to be airtight. I knew Mark's weaknesses, his ego, his need to be admired, and his belief that he could control the narrative. Christina's weaknesses were different. She wanted stability and validation. She wanted the sort of life that looked respectable on the outside. Those desires became the hooks I used to bait them. Step 1, financial pressure. I started small, calling the bank under the guise of reconciling an account, checking details I'd once been privy to through shared finances, and learning enough to know where to hit. Mark loved his tidy ledger, his sense of being the provider. I set in motion a paper trail that would uncover the extent of his duplication. Hidden accounts, transfers to an unfamiliar name, which would eventually, oh yes, reveal more than money. Money leaves tracks. It tells stories when people hope it will hide them. Step 2, isolation. People who cheat depend on confusion and plausible deniability. If you pull the curtain and light floods out, their options narrow.
I began to invite mutual friends for dinner, properly arranged, casual, and made sure to subtly highlight moments that exposed Mark's discomfort around Christina. Little mentions about busy days that Mark had used as cover, remarks about the spare room and how mace it was that Christina had a place to stay, the way he always seemed to rearrange his schedule when she was around. You'd be surprised how often an unguarded throat gives a secret away when the truth is hinted, not shouted. Step 3. Legal groundwork. I consulted a lawyer under a false pretense. I framed it as a routine inquiry about separation support for a hypothetical friend. It felt cowardly at first, pretending to be someone else, but I needed leverage. I learned what evidence would be needed if I wanted a divorce that didn't leave me penniless, and to ensure any child support or custody claims could be disputed appropriately. I needed protection. I needed contingency plans for any attempt to gaslight me. That lawyer's office became a quiet, practical refuge where I learned how to turn emotion into evidence. I kept my daily life as normal as possible. You'd be amazed how much people underestimate the power of a steady face. I made coffee in the morning, worked at my job, attended meetings, smiled when required, all while my insides were an incinerator. That ordinary veneer made them comfortable. It made them careless. I started collecting the small betrayer artifacts: photos, screenshots, time-stamped texts, bank statements. I snapped a picture of Mark's business card left on the spare room dresser the night he forgot it. I saved an errant voicemail meant for him on his phone when he'd accidentally synced it to a cloud I had access to years earlier. Little things that, when stacked, create a mountain impossible to deny. That's the thing about evidence. In the dark, it's useless. In the light, it's lethal. The first confrontation I staged was subtle. I didn't scream. I didn't throw plates. I invited Christina to lunch, like I had dozens of times before. We sat across from each other in a small cafe that smelled of espresso. She spoke first about the baby, about fear, about the pain, and about how Mark had been so good to her. Her voice was soft, spinning what she meant to be a story of rescue into a tale of mutual affection. I smiled until my face hurt. I asked gentle, precise questions. When had she told her ex about returning to the city? When did Mark say he loved her? The more she talked, the more holes in her story appeared. People who lie consistently are either very practiced or very sloppy. Christina had never been careful. Her guilt showed in the tiny contradictions, the way her hands trembled when she said something untrue. Then, I let her feel a sliver of fear. I told her, calmly, that I'd seen them. I watched the color leave her face. She tried to laugh it off, said it was a misunderstanding. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I told her I would be waiting for her to be honest, and I left. It was like walking out of a trapdoor. The difference between screaming and silence is context. Sometimes silence is louder. To Mark, I offered a mirror. I made sure our mutual friends could see the strain between us, where before everyone assumed it was normal couple tension. In public, I clipped phrases into quiet remarks to our circles. Isn't it strange how much time he spends at the hospital lately? Or funny how life surprises people? Those comments were like breadcrumbs that led curious minds right to the kitchen where secrets were cooked. People talk. People gossip. Truth finds allies in small communities.
But the part of the plan I adored, because brutal things can sometimes contain a certain beauty, was the social unmasking. Mark loved being seen as the noble martyr, the man who quietly supported a friend in need. I used that. I arranged a fundraiser at a community center, a faux event to support new mothers that Mark, in his need to be admired and to cleanse his conscience, gladly volunteered to help organize. I set it up with a tight guest list: neighbors, friends, coworkers, and a few people I knew had eyes and mouths that didn't stay shut. It was public, bright, full of faces who would later be surprised, and it would place Mark and Christina under a communal microscope. The night of the fundraiser, Christina arrived with her husband, not the legal husband, but the man who stood as a polite buffer, And Mark was there too, smiling, tidy. He gave a speech about community, about being there for others, his voice full of a practiced humility that made some people nod and others roll their eyes. He didn't know the strings I had pulled behind him. He didn't see the cameras I had quietly asked friends to hold, or the messages I'd sent to a young woman he'd been neglecting because I wanted to watch a particular reaction. I watched Christina move through the room, looking for comfort in people's faces, and every time someone addressed her as, "Christina, you're so brave," she would look at Mark and he would squeeze her hand. What came next was slow and deliberate. I'd arranged for a woman named Elena, someone Mark had flattered months before and whom he'd ghosted with promises of coffee, to come to the fundraiser. She stood at the back with a phone recording, a small smile on her lips. When Mark finished his speech and the applause thinned, I asked to say a few words, a false pretext for longer gratitude, and I walked up to the microphone. I could feel my heart hammering, but the sound I wanted to make was calm, even. I spoke about community, about trust, about the easy things that make people assume safety. I thanked Mark for everything he'd done publicly. The audience clapped politely. I held their attention for a heartbeat longer. Then, soft as breath, I told a story. I told how sometimes the people you expect to protect you are the same ones who cut the deepest. I painted a picture, no names, no finger pointing, just a narrative framed as a cautionary tale. I watched faces tighten. I saw Mark's knuckles whiten. I glanced at Christina and saw something break in her expression. The seeds I'd sowed turned into visible, awkward discomfort. People turned to each other, murmured, and the talk spread like a tide. After that night, the net tightened. Mark started looking over his shoulder. He became sloppy. He responded to messages with one-syllable replies and then tried to apologize with flowers and calls. Gifts are the currency of guilt. They're tiny bribes that try to reduce complex harm to a tidy transaction. I refused every peace offering. I wanted the truth out, not roses wilting on our table. There were low moments, of course. I remember nights where I would sit in the dark and cry so hard my shoulders shook, and then a cold, hungry resolve would rise and settle over me like armor. The important thing in the aftermath of betrayal is that you let yourself feel fully and messily, and then you set your face toward action. I told myself over and over that pain was not the same as defeat. The most satisfying part of my plan was watching Mark begin to unravel socially. Word spreads fast when you move in small, interconnected circles. What you must understand is that people prefer easy narratives. When given pieces of gossip, they fill in the blanks with the ugliest assumptions. I didn't have to lie. I simply put the facts within easy reach, and people, hungry for drama, made the rest into fireworks. At work, Mark's composure faltered. He started missing meetings, making flippant comments, and people noticed. A colleague who prided herself on being discreet hummed about complicated personal things, and someone else fed the rumor mill with a comment about seeing him with a woman in the hospital. Nothing overt, but the kind of gossip that stains reputations over lunch breaks and small talk. By the time we finally confronted each other, Mark wasn't the same man I'd married. His words were sharp, defensive. He tried to gaslight me, saying I was paranoid, that I'd misinterpreted things, that Christina was a friend in need. He said the thing all cheaters say when they're backed into a corner. It meant nothing. As if lying in the dark with someone in whispers and in shared hospital rooms is a meaningless collage of coincidences. As if sharing intimate moments while standing in the doorway of another life is nothing more than a mistake. Those words were fuel. By then, I'd assembled enough proof to make him sweat, text messages he thought deleted, emails where he'd accidentally used my login on a shared computer while writing to Christina, receipts that put him in the right places at the right times, a photograph I had taken from my car window one rainy afternoon of him leaving Christina's apartment holding a bag of groceries, a small stack of napkins from the hospital cafeteria with his fingerprints. None of it would set the sky on fire on its own, but together they made an undeniable portrait.
I remember the exact moment I decided to pull the lever. It's funny how so much of revenge is an accumulation, 1,000 small choices making one inevitable one. I sent an email. It had a subject line so dry it almost read like a scheduling note. Family, important conversation. In it, I CC'd people who mattered, our mutual friends, a few family members, Mark's sister who had always been suspicious of his eccentric absences, and, crucially, the manager of the company where Mark volunteered on weekends. I asked everyone to join me at our home that coming Sunday afternoon for tea and conversation. No details. Curiosity does the rest. You should have seen him when the email went out. He texted, begged, tried to manipulate, promised explanations. He called me names when I didn't answer. I kept my voice level. I kept my eyes on the clock. There is power in a calm face. It unsettles people whose weapon has always been the assumption of your emotional collapse. Sunday arrived, bright and ordinary. People came with the kind of hesitant smiles that suggested they expected a family argument, but not a catastrophe. I had the house arranged to look welcoming. There were flowers on the table and biscuits in a neat stack. Mark sat stiffly on the couch, fidgeting. Christina arrived, pale and fragile-looking, clutching a handbag. She smiled weakly at aunts and cousins, the room filled with that awkward prelude to revelations where everyone should have been able to say whatever needed to be said. I started quietly. I spoke about family, about the ways we protect each other or choose not to. Then I unfolded a folder full of evidence. I put the photos on the coffee table, the printed messages, the bank transfer records, the schedule of late-night hospital visits. I spoke slowly, deliberately, about what I had seen that day in the hospital and about how honesty was a currency she had traded away. People reacted as they do when a secret becomes visible. Gasps, averted eyes, an attempt to rationalize. Mark's face went pale first, then red, then a strange, thin smile that said he was still trying to buy time. Christina began to cry, not the soft, quiet tears of guilt, but the noisy, red-faced kind that tore through her composure. She mouthed 1,000 apologies. She begged. She explained. She blamed his loneliness. She blamed her fear. She offered a story where she was the wounded one. But the facts were there, impassive and cold. The moment of truth was not a cinematic shouting match. It was worse. It was the long, slow collapse of pretense. Mark tried a few last moves. He insisted the child wasn't his, a ridiculous, desperate thing to claim when there were texts discussing pregnancy and a model ultrasound she'd shared with him. He promised to change, to get counseling, to make amends. But counseling doesn't heal deceit. Words don't knit back together a trust that someone has shredded thread by thread. We moved to the legal endgame. With the evidence compiled, the lawyer wrote a letter demanding accountability and detailing terms for separation. I wasn't cruel about money. I was precise. I wanted to leave with dignity and the security to rebuild. Mark wanted to fight in public, to gaslight and to use our shared history as ammunition. He hired an attorney who specialized in delay tactics. They tried to drag it out. Delay is a tactic cheaters use because it wears you down. Eventually, you'll accept crumbs to end the pain. But I was prepared. I had arranged for temporary housing, financial advice, and a friend who would always be present to tell me the truth when my head spun. The divorce proceedings were the theater of ruin I had to walk through. Mark's duplicity became public in slow, mortifying increments. Friends took sides because humans are storytellers, and they need to align narratives to feel safe. Some sided with him, some with me. But the crucial thing was that his reputation could not withstand the accumulation of the facts. In town, he had a manly image of being the good father, the reliable colleague, the nice neighbor. Those images split like glass when people saw collated messages and photographs. The same man who'd play noble on Sundays had been slipping into other lives on weekdays. The climax, I imagined, was not the court papers or the signing of documents. The climax was the fallout at his workplace. Mark had always cherished his social standing, the respect from colleagues, the nods of approval from the board. I had friends there who were sympathetic and quietly, like a patient surgeon cutting a tumor out piece by piece, they fed the narrative one discrete fact at a time. One morning, there were whispers. 2 weeks later, his supervisor called him into the office and gave him a warning about conduct unbecoming. The company didn't need to fire him to wound him. They simply began to distance themselves, to uninvite him to charity dinners, to keep him off committees he'd been proud to chair. Humiliation was meted out in small, public measures, canceled speaking engagements, the slow drip of invitations that once were automatic. He who was seen as a pillar now struggled to secure the basic respect he once took for granted. That was the sweetness of watching someone who valued social capital watch it drain away. I am not proud of enjoying that, but I'm not ashamed either. Justice tastes like the air after rain on a thirsty street.
And Christina? She lost more in some ways. The neighborhood is crueler to the women who transgress the unwritten rules. While Mark had some institutional insulation, job, reputation, the very excuses that allowed him to hide, Christina had only herself and her newborn. People who had been kind before were now whispering at the grocery, avoiding eye contact. Her parents refused her calls at first. I should tell you I felt vindictive joy in seeing her cornered by the social consequences she seemed to have thought were impossible. But grief is complicated. I felt a hollow where once my attachment to her had been. The sister I had loved had made choices that created a child and a mess. I could hate her, and I did, but the hatred was mixed with a strange, sharp sorrow. The fall must be complete for a feeling of satisfaction to really take root. So I took care to see that it was. I ensured child paternity tests were arranged publicly. When the results confirmed what the evidence pointed to, it was, perversely, a relief. Not for me, but for the shape of truth. It meant the narrative could no longer twist to accommodate denial. It meant the world could breathe and begin to rearrange itself into a truthful order. The very last scene, the moment that felt like closing a chapter, came at a small gathering I threw once the divorce was finalized. People came not to celebrate pain, but to acknowledge a new phase. I stood in the center of the room, nervous, the toast in my hand. I spoke about endings and beginnings and the corrosive nature of lies. I watched Mark sit at the far end, the lines around his eyes sharper, his clothes more worn than they used to be, as if the internal erosion had carved him. He looked smaller to me then, not because he had lost weight, but because the illusion had dissipated. Then I said something I had rehearsed for months and that felt as clean as a blade. I told him simply that the truth had weight, and the truth had finally been allowed to sit where it belonged. I didn't shout. I didn't ask for apologies I knew were useless. I let the room do what rooms do, hold witness. Witness is a powerful thing. It asks nothing of the liar but to stand in the light. After that, I left town for a season. I moved to a small apartment by the river where the nights smelled of wet concrete and possibility. I canceled my social media for a while. I reread books I'd abandoned. I worked, saved, slept. Revenge had been a long, bitter course, and once it had run, it left me oddly empty. There's a common idea that revenge fills you with sweet triumph, and then you ride off into dusk. The truth is more complicated.
After the storm, there's a flat, quiet space where you may expect joy, but find only a new plain where the grass has burned and regrowth is patient. I didn't go out looking for new lovers to replace old wounds. I wanted silence, solitude that wasn't lonely. I wanted to understand who I had become. There is a dangerous romanticization of revenge in many stories, the grim satisfaction that feels justified. I will tell you plainly, the satisfaction I felt was not giddy. It felt like the closing of a painful wound. The sound of a lock deliberately clicked shut. The air tasted like mineral cold. I slept better. I walked taller. But I also had to do the work of rebuilding trust in myself, learning to be vulnerable in a way that didn't make me naive. People who watched the unraveling later said things like, "You were brave." People will say that to try to comfort themselves that they would stand tall if faced with the same pain. I know for many, it's easier to imagine themselves heroic than to accept the crippling fear betrayal inspires. For me, bravery had more to do with stubbornness, the unwavering insistence that the truth would be visible, that dignity could be reclaimed. I don't want anyone to think I'm some moral paragon. I plotted, I provoked, I played the long game. That's not noble. It's necessary when the lie is a threat to your life. Now, months later, I run into Mark sometimes, which is funny because the world shrinks and expands in odd ways after such a rupture. He avoids looking at me like someone passing a roadside accident might avert their eyes. But once when our gaze met for a heartbeat, there was no apology on his face. He looked tired and oddly translucent. I felt nothing that resembled triumph then. I felt a strange compassion for a man who had lost the currency he thought would save him. But the compassion doesn't erase the fact of what happened. You might ask whether I told Christina to grovel or whether I wanted to watch her fall harder. The truth is, I wanted her to feel the consequences, to know the gravity of what she'd done. The child she had would always be an innocent in this. I made sure no harm came to the baby. I never wished that. People who seek revenge often forget the innocence. I didn't. I protected the child in every way I could. You can hold two truths at once. Someone's actions deserve consequences, and a child's well-being must be preserved. Sometimes people write to me and ask, was it worth it? My answer is complicated. If you mean, did the exposure and legal victory repair my heart? No. Trust, once so thoroughly betrayed, does not simply return. But if the question is, did restoring the truth give me back control? Then yes. It returned me a measure of agency I thought I had lost. If the question is, did you get satisfaction? Then yes. But it was a hard, quiet satisfaction, the kind that settles in your bones, not a cinematic scream.
Other people ask what I would have done differently. I would have told myself to move faster on the practicalities. I would have taken better care of my emotional health early on. I would advise anyone betrayed to document in ways that protect their future, but to also have one trusted person to lean on who can see them without judgment. Revenge can be a blinding thing. Let it be a tool, not a life. Let me be blunt. Revenge is a dangerous teacher. It teaches you the art of manipulation with sharp techniques and the ethics of thresholds. At what point does righting a wrong become its own harm? That is why I tried, as much as my aching heart allowed, to keep the child safe and to minimize collateral damage. I wanted to be precise, not vindictive with no aim. The more precise you are, the less you become like what you hate. The fallout changed the ecosystem of my life. Some friendships died. Some new ones sprouted out of people who chose honesty over convenience. I reoriented myself around people who didn't ask me to forgive an obvious wrong for the sake of social peace.
There is a clarity that emerges from sitting through the smoke of destruction. You begin to see who remains when the curtains are torn down. If you're hearing this and you've been betrayed, here are a few quiet things I learned that might help. First, collect evidence, but don't be consumed by it. Evidence gives you power. Obsession destroys your peace. Second, keep your dignity in public. People respect the measured response more than theatrical collapse. Third, don't try to prove to the world that you were right. Prove it to yourself by creating a life you can step into without apology. Lastly, protect the innocents. Children, bystanders, people who had no part in the betrayal. I won't lie and say the scars don't remain. There are nights when I hear a voice in my head and imagine the worst, when I question myself and worry about trusting again. That fear is a new part of me, like a scar that tightens in cold weather. But I also have moments of fierce joy that are entirely mine. A cup of coffee I didn't have to share, a quiet evening with a book, a laugh that comes easy because it isn't shadowed by doubt. Those small freedoms are the real treasure. Be honest, would you have waited this long for payback? I don't know if I recommend the slow, surgical method for everyone. Some people need immediate closure, an explosive confrontation to wake them out of numbness. Others, like me, find that slow, meticulous exposure gives a steadier, more lasting form of justice. It depends on what you want to achieve. If you want to punish someone publicly, be prepared for the mess that comes with that. If you want to reclaim your life, consider a measured approach that protects your future. If you want the raw truth, yes, the revenge was dark and satisfying in the precise ways I intended. It exposed lies, stripped away facades, and put the consequences where they belonged. But it also cost me. It forced me to be someone I hadn't intended to be. Calculating and unrelenting. I grieved that version of myself I'd once hoped I'd never need to unlock. The last thing I'll say is about the sound of quiet. The wind down by the river carries a clarity that's hard to find in cities. I go there when I need perspective. Sometimes I watch parents with children and I feel a complex tenderness. I remember the hospital hallway in a way that no one else will, and the memory has a weight that isn't shame, but a kind of carved lesson. I learned that betrayal is a teacher with an enormous bill, and that paying it doesn't return what was lost, but it can build a sturdier house. So tell me in the comments where you're hearing this story. From a bedroom, a car, a late-night kitchen light? I want to know how far it's gone. If my story helps you plan your steps, or if it gives you the courage to gather evidence or contact a lawyer, then some good has come of a painful thing. And if you're tempted to send angry messages to the people who hurt you, remember, use your pain to make a plan, not to drown in noise. In the end, I got what I wanted, truth laid bare, consequences applied, and a chance to start over. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't cinematic in the way people imagine. There were no dramatic confrontations with shouted confessions and collapsing facades. It was paper and patience and the small domestic victories that add up over months. A loan refused, an invitation not reissued, a reputation quietly crumbling. It was the slow revelation that the people who hurt you aren't invincible. If you're listening because you're angry, let that anger be your compass, not your dictator. Plan, protect, keep the innocents safe. And when you finally close the door on the chapter, burn nothing. Keep the ashes as a reminder. The world will keep turning, and one day you will too. Lighter in some ways and heavier in others, but still standing. And when you stand, remember that sometimes justice is not about spectacle, it's about the quiet return of right to its place.